Hi, and welcome back to another upload from the observation deck. Glad you could join me. This week's contribution takes a closer look at the hidden history of Tartaria and the connections with technology that may look like archaeological finds but remain for the most part an anomaly to us, since we have had no education on what many believe is a history that has been hidden from our collective consciousness. While much of what has gone before us has been eradicated from history, evidence still exists in the form of ancient artifacts, out-of-place artifacts, or UPARTs as they've come to know, architectural anomalies and imagery which depicts items or writings that contradict the current world view. Many people believe there is no way to prove these reality glitches or worldwide Mandela effects, if in fact that is what they are. And these historical anomalies are simply a result of an overactive imagination. Well, keep watching, because at the very least you'll be left with some insights or some insane questions, and most of your eyes will be opened to the history that has been hidden from you. See you on the other side of this duality of... back, and thank you again for taking the time to view and listen to my latest contribution to finding truth in a sea of historical confusion and, quite frankly, lies. Today's vlogcast tracks the erosion of Great Tartaria from the history books and brings you some interesting images and information that you may not have previously seen. Just to establish the location and the sheer size of an empire now almost forgotten, but obviously with the works of myself and others, I want to take you through just a few maps. I'm not going to inundate you with the maps at all, but this will help establish the boundaries and the sheer cultural influence of the Great Tartarian Empire, of Great Tartaria. So here we are with my first map of Grand Tartaria, or Tartaria, and as you can see here, it's a pretty huge chunk, a pretty large tract of landmass here. So this is just to establish where we are on the globe, and you can see down the bottom here, this looks like it was 1684. So excuse me for a second, there we go. On the next map you can see that this one, let me just check, I can't see a date on this one, but again it gives us an idea of the sheer size. And interestingly enough to note here, a couple of things really is, number one, there's no India stated here and China is non-existent. So according to this map, the empire literally encompassed most, I mean, it's one of the largest empires that history has ever known. So let's move on to the next one, and again China now has appeared on this map, and as you can see, so has India. So obviously maps change over time, boundaries change with wars, conflict, everything else. So but you can still see clearly the Caspian Sea, even though it's not named there, is there. That kind of gives me my center point, as it were. So it gives you some idea of the geographical area we're talking about, the influences that we have. What I want to point out, in fact, let me just go back, because I found it quite interesting to note. Was it this one? Sorry, excuse me for a second, I'm jumping all over the place here. That this, in case you hadn't noticed, is obviously modern day Russia, and as you will all know, modern day Russia, above Russia to the northern tracks, is the Atlantic Ocean, and you can quite clearly see here it was the Tartarian Sea. If we go back on a couple of other maps, I don't know whether they name there, Mer di Tartaria, which is the Sea of Tartaria. So as you can see there, they've even changed the name of the ocean. I mean, I could understand boundaries changing and all the rest of it, but you change the name of the sea, which is clearly Tartaria's territory. And again, Tartarian Sea, the West Ocean. So I understand that they can update names, but again, you know, it's really just another example of how we can manipulate and change history. And as you can see from here, the Empire flag and the famous owl, and I'm sure you've already seen this, so I don't want to dwell too much on this and waste your time. Now, what I did find interesting, as you can see, flags of all nations. Now, I couldn't find a date when this book was actually published, but obviously you can see it's pretty old anyway. But if I try and zoom in on here, you can quite clearly see that the Tartary flag is there. What I also found interesting, in the same book, if they've mentioned the flag, you can actually see here population of the world, distribution of regions and races. What I found interesting is if you're going to list the flag of an empire, then where on these maps, let's go to Asia, let's have a look, India, Japan, Belgium, absolutely no mention of Tartaria. None whatsoever. Not that I can see. Which is kind of strange when you think about it, because if you're going to mention the fact that yes, it's here, but we've actually forgotten about it here because we just call it Europe. As you can see, it's all Europe. I suspect this was clearly printed by Europeans, as you can see by the language. But what I find even more interesting is that when you look at the numbers here, I don't know, for argument's sake, let's take North America and West Indies. You can see that area in square miles. Now, obviously, you've got different areas of America and the West Indies, but what I found particularly insulting, to be honest with you, is that the native Indians, which there is 1 million of them, as you can see there, population. They've not been given any land in this book, written by the white man, and they're called uncivilized Indians. Uncivilized. I don't normally swear on my videos, but bloody hell, give the guys a break. I mean, not only did you steal their land and give them smallpox, but you can't even give them a mention of land. So according to this book, in actual fact, uncivilized Indians, and I'm quoting from the book, I don't for a second believe that the original inhabitants were uncivilized in any shape or form, but they haven't actually given them any area of land. So it kind of portends to what was to come. But in contradiction to what you've just seen there, I want to show you this, which is another book, an entry from a book on geography. And what I find most interesting, now keep in mind the map that we've just seen and the numbers that we've got down there. And now let's just have a little look here. The division, I'm not quite sure what that word means, but we've got the square mileage. All right, now considering the other map, no, Tartaria doesn't have any square miles, but if you look down this list, we've got Asia, and then we've got Turkey, Albania, and then we've got Tartary. So number 7, Tartary, with 3 sub-principalities here. That's just what I'm calling them, or territories. But if you look at the square mileage, it doesn't matter where you look down this square mileage, look at the sheer size of the totals of Tartary, or Tartary, yeah. Okay, so 600,044 square miles, 778 and 3 million. So if you have this combination here, you've got 4 million plus square miles, which is, if you look at this, is the largest land tract anywhere, which kind of contradicts, well, actually on this map, no, the Tartars didn't have any area of land whatsoever. Well, then what the hell is this? 3,050,000. So this combination, because obviously these are I'm not going to do the maths at the moment, but I'm just giving you the point where even historically there's anomalies between what's being printed and clearly motives. So the next one is, you've probably seen this before, a map of the world as they knew then. And if we scroll down here, you've got Tartaria in this and the Caspian Sea. Now it's a bit, I found it a little bit overwhelming because there's no gaps and there's an awful lot of information, but there's some huge look at the size of these buildings. But what I found interesting about these is look at the similarity across the globe of architecture in every single area. Even in Europe, you've got these domes on the top, as we've seen in so many pre-mud flood buildings, and I'll get to those in a short while. But from all the way over here, where we've got Europa, you can see these types of buildings. There's one there. And if you stretch it all the way over here, you've got the same types across the other side of the world. So again, you know, the influences, and I'm not saying necessarily these were the influences of Tartaria, but given the sheer size that we've just looked at of the land that it commanded, it is and was the greatest empire in the history of, or known history, should I say. So it would have such a huge influence, especially from a trading point of view, architecture, science, and let's face it, from this part of the world, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, most of it came from, and it was usurped in certain forms by the Greeks and the Romans, and obviously the white Europeans, of which I am one, but that doesn't mean to say I have to fall in line with the lies that they've told throughout history. Now here's an interesting piece of information I dug up as well, which is the genealogy of the ancient emperors of Tartaria, or Tartaria, we'll just call it Tartaria for argument's sake. But you can see the genealogy goes back absolute generations. I mean, I couldn't calculate these, but on average a generation is what, 30 years, and all of these offshoots. Now I'm not sure in which direction it goes, to be honest with you, but it's huge. And you can see again the map underneath with the Caspian Sea, and it's even got this on this map, the Tartarian Sea, and the sheer size of the empire that was. And this interested me because I thought you guys would be interested in this as well, because I think this is a bit of early 1654, you can see down there, propaganda. So Tartarium, or the conquest of great and most renowned empire of China, by the invasion of the Tartars who left their last 7 years, have wholly fubbed that evil empire, together with a map of the provinces. Obviously I haven't got the other pages, but the Western Tartars who were later overrun, can't make out that word himself, almost, of the whole empire of China. Oh, basically this guy kicked China's butt, and it was printed for John Cook and are to be sold at his shop at the sign of the ship in St Paul's Churchyard, 1654. Now, why do I think this is a bit of propaganda? Well, not so much propaganda. Well, yeah, it was propaganda, because at the sign of the ship, so at St Paul's Yard. Now remember, those of you, and I lived in London for quite a number of years myself, and the sign of the ship near St Paul's Churchyard, we're talking about on the banks of the River Thames. And at that point in time, obviously there was a lot of trading going on, and I seem to think that John Cook wanted to I don't know, curry favour, should we say, with the subject matter in the book, and the people, and especially the emperor, would give him favourable deals, as it were, on whatever it was they were trading. So he had a nice book printed, and he probably ended up giving it as a gift to the guy whose photo you see there. But hey, that's just pure speculation, but business is business. And there we have it. As far as I'm concerned, that's enough information that you need of the sheer size, 3 million plus square miles of empire just there, and the influence of architecture all over the world. And I know a few have asked, well, why all the revelations now and the surfacing of Tartaria and its historical evidence? And for this part, the solution is pretty straightforward, although the motives behind it may not be. Because Vladimir Putin signed off on opening up the Russian archives, I think it was around 2013. And this effectively opened the floodgates to the current rise of historical interest. Well, maybe not the interest, but the current flood of information that was released on Tartaria. What concerns me even more isn't the fact that Putin released those records. It was the fact that they were so easily able to hide them in the first place, which brings into question, obviously, is how many governments around the world have just simply deleted historical facts, removed them from the history books, and told us that, well, it just doesn't exist. If you can release something that opens up these sorts of floodgates, then what is sitting behind the dam of lies and suppression the governments everywhere worldwide are keeping? And let's be clear, it's not just our governments, that's the Western governments and Russia. I would suspect it's every single government in the world that there's the ability to not only keep secrets but change not the course of history, but the details about history, so therefore the course of the present and the future. And if, for those doubting Thomases out there that think, no, that was ridiculous, this is all conspiratorial stuff, well, let me remind you by showing you a quick clip of George Orwell's 1984, and perhaps you can figure out just how easy it is, just from this short excerpt, to manipulate the past, present and the future. Now, many people say that George Orwell wrote a fantastic novel, 1984. Personally, I think it was a documentary. Take a look at this.
In 1949, George Orwell had a vision of the future. Today, that vision is still a best-selling novel, and his prophecy remains as terrifying as ever.
There's one man that set power over another by making him suffer. Exactly. Obedience is not enough. Power is inflicting pain and humiliation, otherwise you cannot be sure. Power is tearing human minds apart and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Power is not a means, it is an end. In our world, there will only be triumph and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy. The past is forbidden. Why? Because when we can cut man from his own past, then we can cut him from his family, his children, other men. There is no loyalty except loyalty to the party. There is no love except love of Big Brother. All competing pleasures we will destroy. If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. We control life at all levels. We create human nature. Men are infinitely malleable. Or perhaps you return to your old idea that the proletarians will arise. Put it out of your mind. They're helpless animals. Humanity is the party.
I don't care. In the end, they'll beat you. Sooner or later, they'll tear you to pieces.
On what evidence?
Goldstein's book.
I wrote it. Or at least I collaborated in writing it. No book is individually produced, as you know.
I just believe it. I know you'll fail. There's something in this world, some spirit that you will never overcome.
What is it, this principle?
I don't know. The spirit of man.
And do you consider yourself a man?
Yes.
If you're a man, you're the last man. Your kind is extinct. We are the inheritors. understand that you're alone. You're outside history. You unexist.
I think Orwell's words spoken by Richard Burton speak for themselves, and we seem to be living within the pages of that novel today. With the control of information comes the control of knowledge, and with the control of knowledge comes the control of thought. The saying goes, if you can control history, you can control the present, and if you control the present, you control future history. Our present is straight from the pages of Orwell's book. To the digital age, our knowledge has been eroded, and I can appreciate how difficult it is to know fact from fiction, when even in our present day, governments seek to suppress, divert, create false flags, and therefore when we look back on it, or our children look back on it, they get a completely different false view of history. Names change, map boundaries are moved, books that have been burnt, and whole histories that have been eradicated. And this has been in the way of the winners since the advent of wars, for going back centuries. The digital version of that now, I suppose you could say, well, Google wants to control all knowledge. It thinks it's some kind of modern oracle, when in fact it's the global, it's probably the largest global censorship machine that there is. Wikipedia is not far behind it. Facebook is trying to close down anyone with an alternative view that doesn't meet the party's view. So, you know, forgive me when I say that we are living in that Orwellian future, and that it's been standard practice for millennia to remove any trace of people from history that they didn't want you and I to know about. As they say, history is written by the winners of war, and here's a prime example.
Slaughtering all those men of yours has it's left a nasty cramp in my leg, so kneeling will be hard for me.
There will be no glory in your sacrifice. I will erase even the memory of Sparta from the histories. Every piece of Greek parchment shall be burned. Every Greek historian and every scribe shall have their eyes put out and their tongues cut from their mouths. Why, uttering the very name of Sparta or Leonidas will be punishable by death. The world will never know you existed at all.
The world will know that free men stood against a tyrant, that few stood against many, and before this battle was over, that even a god king can bleed.
So just to clarify, I'm not trying to persuade you through Hollywood scripts or anything like that, but through the truth of the evidence. You can connect the dots for yourself. The evidence presented here on my channel, on Richard Lopez's channel, in terms of the mud flood. I'll leave a link to Richard's channel. I suggest you take a look at it below. And at the end of the day, it's for you to decide whether or not the evidence presented before you has some merit, or in fact you've got a different view of things. So let's get back to the actual details of the mud flood and the images that I've managed to dig up for this particular vlogcast. So as you saw in my last video, Russia, and predominantly Moscow here, suffered from the deluge of mud in or around the early to mid 1800s, as seen here, and the reset had begun. As we know today, there is the capitalist system that has several conflicting corporate trading blocks, clearly on the way to creating one huge worldwide system of economic governance and resource control through endless wars. The move from what could have been a past utopia with free energy has been replaced by the pay-to-play system forged by the merging of trading blocks and the central banks. And yet, there are still many of us who continue to dig into the past and to show we could have a different future. What caught my eye with this particular image was on the long side, running along the ground level there, you can see these small cranes. Now they're either concreting a retaining wall in, or they're digging out along there. But whichever way round it goes, if you were concreting a retaining wall in there, surely you would have done that prior to putting in the footings and the foundations of this building. And if you assume that the ground level was lower than you can see here now, then I would think that that large entrance there you see on the corner was an awful lot larger than is seen with the current level in that particular image. And as you can see from this short video clip that I found, you've got some Russian subterranean hunters, treasure hunters. I don't think it's professional archaeologists, but look at the ground level. And now this was either a sinkhole or they've dug it themselves. But you can have a look closely at the cultural layers as they are known. Or in fact, it was mud flood. Who's to know at this stage? But let's just travel with them down this hole, and you can see the sheer size of the bulk of cultural layers, mud flood. I don't know this one in particular, but I found it particularly interesting from the point of view of just showing you just how much archaeology, how much of the past is sitting below the ground, right beneath our feet. And these guys apparently go exploring all over the place to dig out images, evidence from the past. And as you can see there, the alcoves on the wall, the arches underground, and considering how deep this is, because you saw the building on the top layer, one can only imagine just how much of our past is sitting in places like this, right next to modern buildings that either cars are driving over the top of, or buildings have literally been placed or repurposed on the top of. And the amount of waste that's come in from other areas here that you can quite clearly see through that small arch there is just phenomenal. And it just goes to show that this is just one small aspect of it that these guys have dug out, and this is in fact in Russia, and it proves yet again that there's a lot more going on in terms of our past history than we are led to believe. We could go back thousands of years in our history, and as you can see here, the evidence of humanity recovering from other disasters, and judging by the evidence, comes up time and time again. From the incredible skills that you can see here of those who built the interlocking walls without the need for cement, to the megalithic stones of gigantic proportions cut to perfection. And as you can see here, to the ancient drill holes found in numerous sites worldwide, which cannot be explained with current archaeological information. And yet, to suggest the obvious is looked upon as crazy by the ruling classes. And we've been told not to believe our eyes. When we've been told not to state the obvious, what we're actually being told is not to think for ourselves. And even here on the Giza Plateau, repurposing of old stonework, of old foundations, is not something new. So if the ancients repurposed what had gone before them, then as far as the mud flood is concerned, what makes us think for 1 second that in our recent history that too hasn't been repurposed? Several ideas have been postulated as to the cause of such a huge event, from Halley's Comet back in 1835, which may have caused a vibration and liquefaction all over the world. Personally, I have no idea, but the point being is it could have created tremors vibrating at the exact rate as to cause the soil to move from higher ground to lower regions. And since many towns and cities were constructed near natural water supplies, usually in the valleys and rivers, then they would have found themselves in the path of such an event. If you're a believer in the hollow earth theory, then this again opens up the possibility to a more deliberate act emanating from within the earth, or as a side effect from the actions of them. Whatever the actual cause is, we are left with the aftermath and the evidence which is placed before a curious public. I spoke in my previous video on the mud flood about the idea our ancient ancestors had the ability to tap into free energy and possibly have access to technology that has been lost to us. Personally, I think this seems even more likely now, since I'd found an old set of images you're about to see. These could be considered as simply artists' impressions of drawings, and I'm presenting these to you as I found them, with no alterations whatsoever on my part. However, you may want to consider where the artist got the ideas from, and the fact that this particular artist lived in the region we have now come to know as Tartaria. So you can see from this first image, now not so much concentrating on the duck, but look at the detail in the background here with the pyramids and things coming out of it, and the architecture that you can clearly see in the background. Again, moving on to the second image, it's a pretty organized system and society with huge monuments, seafaring, and very, very high architecture, very advanced architecture for the time. Here's another one that's a close-up of the pyramids that you can actually see there. I'm just going to pause that for a second when it brings it up slightly higher. And as you can see here, these pyramids with these, looks like swans or ducks coming out of the back of them, white llamas in the foreground, and these Tower of Babel-like structures with the big head on them, as you can see there. And as you can see in this image, obviously we've got the pyramids, as I've stated before, in this Tower of Babel-like conical structure. But what I found most interesting as well is this kind of maypole setup that you've got here with people dancing around it. Now the reason I've pointed this out is that this, I don't know about you guys, but this gives me the distinct impression that this is not a drawing or an artist impression. This looks very much like an old photograph to me. And I, for the love of me, have no idea where this pyramid is now and these swans, but this does look more like an old photograph than it does some kind of artist impression. But again, you know, I'm not saying it is, but it sure as hell looks like one. And if I just continue to press play, it gets even more interesting, as you can see quite clearly here. That again, is this an artist impression or is this an old photograph that you can quite clearly see? And I'll just pause the video there, that we've got these huge crafts flying in the air. And notice the pyramids again, and the Tower of Babel heads that looks like swans coming out again over here. But look at these craft. I mean, personally, I think just this image alone is absolutely mind-blowing. Not only are we looking at craft that was, I guess, in the shape of the ancient Vimanas from the ancient Indian text, but again, look at the communications or some kind of power distribution system sitting here, so close to these pyramids. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, notice that the pyramids and the Tower of Babel-like buildings with what looks like swans coming out of them. I've yet to bring my previous research on pyramids to you, but I can tell you this, that they were not tombs or any type of burial chamber. They were locations of power generation by use of sacred geometry. And what we call circuits today were connected internally by mercury. But that's another video entirely. If you like myself are absolutely blown away by this, again, I don't think this looks like an artist's impression per se, but more like an old photograph. And what's even more interesting is that you've got these horses and carts alongside advanced technology, and the people in the streets don't seem to be bothered at all that these crafts are flying above their heads, which for me is just absolutely amazing. And no doubt, if there's someone that can actually read Russian that views this video, I would love you guys to drop in the comments and translate whatever it is that's being written on here. That would be fantastic if you could do that. But if you're anything like me, I was completely blown away by just this one image, but there's more to come. So moving on to the next image is for me again, even it's just as incredible as the previous ones, with the pyramids with the swans clearly seen here in the image, We've also got sort of other styles of architecture there. Let me just pause this while we take time to talk about it. And we've got this mixture of technology which is driven by animals and cart with these Tower of Babel type structures. And you know, given the sort of foxing on the edge of this book and the slight folds here that you can see, again, I don't know whether this is a drawing or a painting or an old photograph, but again, I'm going to come back to the fact that it looks to me like an old photograph. So these Tower of Babel structures, where the people made their way up on these circular pathways or steps, I don't know. You'll also notice that on top of this pyramid here, there's also another structure with pillars on it. So maybe, you know, people went to the top of the pyramid somehow, internally or externally. I have no idea. But again, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the image itself is just absolutely mind-blowing. So let's just move on to the next one. And this I found particularly interesting because it almost shows you, well, I say almost, it clearly shows you that there could well have been mud flood damage here in this image, live as it were, with the pyramid in the background and that particular image. So I don't think these are artist impressions. This is literally another image from a different angle of the same region, but seems to me a slightly later date, with the elephant, and this is, I mean, again, mind-blowing, is the elephant is dragging on a cart flying saucer shaped stone objects. Now what these were used for, I have no idea. And obviously you've got these perfectly spherical balls. So if you can imagine the engineering that was required to create these things. So this looks almost like some kind of post clear up of what we want that once was in the images previously, like I was showing you. Sorry, let me just click back here. This kind of stuff. Now we can look at this with a kind of slightly fresh eye and go, well, is this mud flood damage as well that you can see on this particular ground level, or is it what was there in the past? And if we jump on to the one with the elephant again, you can quite clearly see here that this, to me, it looks like a cleanup operation. It really does. But the fact that these buildings are in the background from a different perspective, I'm still convinced that this is a photograph rather than an artist impression. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty convinced that it is. And the spherical objects and the saucer shape objects are just mind-blowing. And I just want you to remember that these are images that were found when I did a dark web search on Tartaria. So it makes it more even more incredible that they even exist. And for those of you who doubt the validity of these images, let me just show you this image before we move on to the rest of the video, because there is a modern precedence for what you're actually seeing being pulled by the elephant in the image just there. And again, this image was found on the same search criteria, and for those of you who can do image search on Google, you might find out that this too was found in what was Grand Tartaria, which is now obviously Russia. So there is a modern precedence for what we're looking at, which convinces me even further that what we have been looking at are not artist's impressions, but in fact photographs, which I just find absolutely incredible. Now, if you thought these were incredible enough, take a look at the next image, because to be honest with you, I have no words. This is absolutely crazy. I'll pause it there so we can just take a look at it for a moment. But again, it's a photograph, but look at the sheer size and the spherical shape of these objects, clearly carved out of what looks like a very hard stone, almost obsidian like, with a very strong connection to, in my mind, what looks like to India, Asia subcontinent. So the spread of this kind of style and these balls, and I'm sure there are some somewhere now buried under the ground, and you know, these incredible shapes on the buildings, and these solid steel I mean, for all intents and purposes are spherical runs, but they look like modern bobsleigh runs to me. But you've got people looking on of these fantastical objects that we're looking at. We've got street lighting, and of course some of you have already picked up this object flying, this again spherical object flying with what looks like energy or heat coming out of the bottom of it. And no one seems to be bothered whatsoever that there's some kind of, well, we would call it a UFO, so they're probably not bothered because it's a common sight for them. But for us, it's an unidentified flying object. I'm not talking aliens or anything else. At this stage, there's absolutely no need to, because I know I keep saying it, but these just blew my mind, and I'm sure that you looking at them are probably thinking the same thing. But what are they for? What was their purpose? Who built them? The fact that these people are looking at this as if it was a train station of some description. I mean, is this really fancy transportation of some descriptions and we can't see the doors on the other side? I have no idea. But I would welcome comments and suggestions down below, and perhaps, you know, together we can shed some light on exactly what on earth it is we're looking at here. I mean, are we looking at a type of transportation that we've never seen before, like some kind of mag lift situation or vibrational situation where these objects, I mean, they're certainly big enough to house people, and given, I don't know, vibrational frequencies or whatever it may be, can literally transport people from one place to another. So, you know, are we looking at a completely new type of transportation that's never been seen before? I don't know. But again, your comments, speculation, let's all dive in and have a go with it, because your guess is probably just as good as mine. But you will agree that this is just absolutely fantastic. It's just mind-blowingly fantastic. Sorry to keep using that phrase, I can't think of another one. And obviously I mentioned the UFO type object here, which is simply unidentified. And before you sort of all go charging to put it in the comments, yes, I have noticed the one up in the top right hand corner, which is slightly further away, but it seems to be exactly the same as the first one. So let me just hit the play button for what is the last image on here. And as you can see, the city in the background, and what I find most interesting about this, well, there's several points. I find it all interesting, but let me just pause that one here. Let me just point out what looks like some Greek Orthodox priest of some description, clearly superimposed on the top of the city in the background, again with the horse and carts, and holding some kind of disc, which again looks like it's been added. I'll come back to that disc in a minute, because obviously some of you already know what that is, and for those of you who don't, I'll cover that in a second. But again, if you look at I say Greek Orthodox, but it could be Russian Orthodox. You know, forgive me for saying Greek straight off the bat, but a priest or a mystic or whatever it may be. But again, look at the architecture sitting in the background, and this looks very much like water rushing out of this side of the pyramid as well, as you can see. So there could be some hydro generation going on here. I'm not professing for 1 second to know what on earth it is that I'm looking at here, but I want to draw your attention to the base of this building here as well, because we're looking very much like those geometric stone bases that have been finely cut. Now I know we can't see the detail, but the more and more I look at these images, the more I am convinced that they are in fact images rather than artist impressions. So just to cover off the disc that I believe the Greek Orthodox priest has in his hand because of the location of where this particular disc was found. And as you can see here, let me just click on this bit. So I think it's pronounced Phaistos disc. The Phaistos disc is about 6 inches in diameter and contains symbols on both sides, 45 different signs. And as you can see here, where did I read it earlier? It was found on, here we are. The Phaistos disc is about 6 inches in diameter and contains on both sides symbols stamped in a spiral formation. 45 different signs, 242 in all, are represented on the disc. The disc was discovered in 1908 in an early 2nd millennium BCE palace at Phaistos, obviously hence the name, on Minoan, Crete. So that's the disc that the guy has in his hand here. And again, I don't really know why, but that's what tempted me to go straight for the Greek Orthodox priest rather than anything else, or why he's showing it on this. I mean, as up till this point in time, this disc hasn't been deciphered conclusively by anybody. And the sort of guess on this disc is that the disc has been interpreted to be either a hymn, a curse, and even some say an almanac. But you can make your own mind up. But I find it interesting that that he's now got this particular disc in his hand and has been superimposed upon what I still believe, and I'm more convinced, that are images rather than artists' impressions. It now seems clear to me that we are living in a fabricated world with a fabricated history suffering from suppression of technology which could change the world, and while previous knowledge is being kept from us and from the masses. And yet many of us, including myself, will fight to keep the hope of one day revealing the truth and leaving this world in a better place than we found it. Going back to the dire warnings of Orwell, we may well have taken that step too far already, but while there are people still willing to stand up and retain the ability to think for themselves and think critically, we have an opportunity to realise the future we want and not the future which is currently being imposed. Free energy is not a myth. Capitalism is not the only way to run a world, and the human spirit will always prevail. If you feel as strongly as I do, then post this on Facebook. Get it trending on Twitter and reveal it on Reddit, and it helps support our work. I hope you have found this edition from the Observation Deck interesting enough to like, subscribe, and as I said, share on social media platforms worldwide. And for those of you who wish to see more from the Observation Deck, you may wish to consider supporting my research either via PayPal or Patreon in the button on the channel banner or in the link below. Since I very much doubt YouTube will ever allow this channel to be monetized, $1 a month will keep this continuing to bring you videos like this. So please consider helping and hit that like and subscribe button. So until next time, seekers of knowledge, stay curious, question everything, and above all, thank you very much for taking the time to watch. See you on the other side.